Today we have on our show Juan Brown, flying experience of 40 years, instructor at US Air Force, flying commercial, and also a YouTuber. Welcome to Pakistan Observer's YouTube channel. As you are very aware of the situation that happened recently, the PIA aircraft PK-8303 went down. And you said in one of your videos that it was one of the strangest plane crashes you ever came across.
So why the aircraft went around is shaping up to be one of the strangest stories I've seen in an aircraft accident.
So can you tell us more about that?
This is the first time I've heard of an aircraft hitting the runway with the gear up and damaging both engines to the extent that they ended up subsequently failed. What little we know so far at this point, a lot of this is going to be corroborated once the cockpit voice recorder and the data recorder are recovered from this accident and that data is analyzed. But it's appearing at this time that this started out as a very high and hot approach. In other words, the aircraft was approaching the airport from too high of an altitude and too fast of an airspeed. And for whatever reason that we do not understand yet, it appears as if the landing gear was never properly lowered. We don't know at this time if that was because of crew problems or with aircraft problems. There is something with the Airbus that prevents you from lowering the landing gear at too high of an airspeed to avoid damaging the landing gear, and investigators will be looking at that. Nevertheless, it appears as though the aircraft came in too high, too hot, landed long, meaning they landed too far down the runway at too fast of a speed. It appears as though they did not realize that the landing gear was still retracted until they hit the runway at about the halfway point. It appears as though at that point, they suddenly realized that the gear was not extended. And in a reaction, and very much just a reaction, gut reaction mode, they went around in an effort to try to salvage the approach and come back around and properly lower the landing gear. They may have also been keyed to go around ahead of time because they knew they were coming in hot and fast. All of this will be corroborated by the cockpit voice recorder and the data recorder. Once the aircraft hit the runway at a high rate of speed, it impacted the runway right here on the bottom of the engines.
Correct.
Located on the bottom of the engines are the accessory drive gearboxes. If you damage those hard enough, the engines will subsequently fail because inside these gearboxes are things like fuel pumps, oil pumps, hydraulics, and that sort of thing. And the telling evidence of this is in the photograph that the Pakistan observers took of the aircraft in flight after it was struck the runway. You can see damage to the bottom of the engines, and you can see a thing called a ram air turbine extended out of the aircraft. That ram air turbine extends automatically once both engines have been severely damaged to the point that they're no longer producing electrical power, generator power. The aircraft came around to come back to land. The engines apparently subsequently failed, and the aircraft crashed short of the runway on its approach back into 25 left.
Can it be like the fault of the pilot, or do you think it's technical issue within the Airbus?
It's much too early to tell who's at fault at this point. First, we got to find out what happened before we can find out why it happened. And this being such an unusual accident investigation, like most accidents, you're going to find a whole series of events, a whole chain of events that led up to this accident. So it's too, well, I'll tell you here how it's supposed to happen. How it's supposed to happen, the standard operating procedures is supposed to be you have a stabilized approach at 1,000 feet above the ground before you come into land. That means that you have all your checklists completed, your landing gear is down, you are on your proper airspeed, you are on your proper glide slope, all prior to landing. At a minimum, you need to be on that proper airspeed, which is a small 20-knot window of airspeed at a minimum of 500 feet above the ground. So all those squares need to be filled in a normal landing. If in the event that any of those parameters are not met, you need to go around. Either the pilot flying or the pilot not flying needs to direct or tell the pilot to go around, and then they can sort it out later as to why the go around was called, because those parameters were not met. Now, in the event that you have a landing gear malfunction, there are any number of ways to get the landing gear down on these aircraft. In the event that you have a landing gear malfunction on final approach, you simply do not have enough time to sort that out on final approach. You need to initiate a go-around, go up into a holding pattern, and sort out the problem. There's plenty of fuel on board the aircraft to do that, and there's plenty number of ways to get the aircraft, the landing gear down on the Airbus A320, even if there was a problem with the landing gear. Now, there's numerous warnings that are available to the pilots on the aircraft that will automatically alert the pilots as to an unsafe configuration of the aircraft, i.e. not having the landing gear down when you're coming to land. We can hear one of those warnings in one of the radio transmissions. Once we get all the data recorders, all these warnings and all these parameters will be recorded, and we'll be able to clearly see if the warning systems were working correctly on this aircraft.
I see. So it has been like, so what's the role of the control tower basically in this situation where you have to, like the pilot announced and everything, and then the control tower, like what's their role basically, if you can pretty much brief us on that?
The air traffic control is there to serve the pilot. The pilot, the captain, is the ultimate responsibility always for his aircraft. The air traffic control and the tower is there to assist the pilot and ensure proper separation between aircraft. So it's not the air traffic controller's responsibility to be responsible for the landing gear being down on the aircraft. Frequently, in military operations and other operations, you will have, especially when training is taking place, you have observers to help ensure that the landing gear is down. But in civilian operations, that's not necessarily always the case.
Right. So, but we've been there've been speculation that like the pilot told the air control that the gear, like he had some issues with the aircraft. So, but like what precautions does the tower have to take in order to make sure the plane lands, or something like the ambulances,
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're talking about foaming the runway in the event of an emergency. First of all, the air traffic control has to be notified of an emergency. This aircraft did not declare an emergency or a mayday until moments before the final crash. So there was no indication, as far as I know of, that the crew was having an emergency or any problem at all with the landing gear prior to the initial striking of the runway. That's why I think it was a surprise to this crew that they realized that the gear was down. I'm not sure this crew even realized the gear was not down when they first hit the runway. So if you don't tell ATC you've got a problem there, you've got no way to react to a problem that doesn't exist. Now, it's going to be a very interesting case study in human factors, this indirect communication between ATC and the crew regarding their steep approach. ATC, air traffic, was dropping clues to the pilots that, hey, it looks like you're kind of high and steep. Would you want to do something about this? In the audio tapes, you can hear him asking, are you comfortable with this? Are you comfortable? That's to me, out west here, that's non-standard terminology, and it indicates a indirect form of speaking, less than direct form of speaking that's saying, hey, I'm showing you high and hot. You want to do a 360 and descend and slow down before you make this approach? And the pilot said, no, we're fine. We're just going to keep driving on in here. So that whole relationship of communication is going to be studied very closely in this accident.
I see what you mean. So that communication you basically think is a kind of
it's not normal. I mean, it's indicating a high and steep approach, and that the crew should have taken that into account and done something about it, like go ahead and take a 360 or go ahead and take it around and get set up properly for the approach. If you look at this approach angle versus a normal approach angle on a profile, you'll see that this approach angle is much steeper. And again, we'll get the exact data on that from the data recorder on the aircraft.
I see. So people are saying, and there have been speculation that it was a bird strike. Can you tell us what is a bird strike?
It could very well be. Jet aircraft engines are susceptible to bird strikes. If you get enough bird strikes, they will flame the engines via something called a compressor stall. And that's what happened to Sully and the Hudson, for example. And there is a picture, the Pakistan Observer picture. You do see a hawk in the picture, but much more damning evidence is the damage to the bottom of the engines. Other things investigators will be looking at is, if you look at the pictures of the engines in the wreckage, the high bypass fan section, all those fans look to be very well intact, indicating that they were not producing any little or any power upon impact, which would indicate that both engines failed. And I'm pretty sure investigators will find that both engines failed as a result of the damage they sustained from hitting the runway. Bird strike's certainly a possibility, and they'll be able to sort that out in the investigation as well. But probably more likely the damage on the runway.
Right. So what is the black box? They've been searching the black box. They found it, and now the teams from France are coming to investigate. So can you tell us about the black box and the French team coming? What's the correlation?
Sure. This is key to the investigation. Of course, the Airbus is made in France, and the French accident investigation team is excellent at downloading and safely recording the data that comes from the black boxes. The black boxes consist, which are actually orange, consists of a flight data recorder, which gives you all the parameters of the aircraft, airspeed, altitude, configurations, any exceedances of any aircraft parameters. And then, of course, the cockpit voice recorder, which is an area microphone inside the cockpit. So it should be able to pick up the conversation between the pilots as well as the radio transmissions as well. So you put those two together in a timeline, and it paints a very clear picture as to what happened to the aircraft. And it's required in all of these commercial aircraft. So the accident investigators from France are very experienced at downloading this data and putting it together, which is the basis for your accident investigation report. This information is vitally critical to get to the bottom of this.
I see. So and can you tell us what is belly landing? Because people are in the pictures that we see is the pilot tried to do a belly landing because
basically it's landing without your landing gear extended. So instead of landing on your wheels, you're landing on the bottom of the airplane. And in the case of these Airbus aircraft and most all modern jet airliners, if you come in high, hot, and fast, you're going to touch down here on the bottom of the engine cowlings first. And if you're so fast and you skip across the runway, you can potentially skip across the runway without hitting the tail or minimum damage to the tail. So that's another clue as to why I think this came in just much too fast. So a belly landing is basically landing without your landing gear. This is very rare in the airline industry because we have so many warning systems and standard operating procedures built in to prevent this from happening. The gear won't automatically come down. You have to lower the gear.
Right.
However, in small aircraft, civilian aviation, this is a much more common problem. but in airlines, it's very, very rare.
I see. Do you think the four-story building can play a part in the crash? I mean, around the airport, like there are few like more than four-story or four-story building, they play a role.
Because it's too tall and it's in the flight path of the aircraft potentially. They'd have to do a survey of the airport, and yes, all airports need to be surveyed and have a minimum climb gradient of clear airspace around the airport. And I suspect that building is far enough away from the runway to meet those requirements. But that's a great question. I haven't considered that. But airport designers will easily be able to tell you if that building meets the minimum clear flight path parameters or not. But airports are typically located near populated areas. Otherwise, it's just too far away from town to be convenient.
Right. So since you have so much experience in this aircraft and flying planes in a commercial and military, what do you think are the chances of surviving a plane crash since you analyze so many crashes?
That's the fact that nobody on the ground was killed is quite amazing, and that there were two survivors on board the airplane. I understand one of the survivors, his entire seat and everything left the aircraft, and he landed outside of the aircraft. So, very, very almost miraculous that two people could survive and nobody on the ground got killed. I understand there were four injured on the ground was all.
I see. Do you think what would be your suggestion to the airline, or maybe in the future not to have this kind of tragic event?
Well, this is going to take a long time to unfold this. What you got to do is look at this accident and any and all previous accidents that Pakistan International Airlines has sustained over the years, and you're going to get a clearer picture as to what needs to be changed. Right now, I can just say standard operating procedures and crew resource management are two huge factors that need to be just absolutely driven home on every training mission, on every flight. It's very hard to get these standardized the same all around the world. Standard operating procedures and crew resource management. CRM, that means working together as a team, the pilot and the co-pilot, where the co-pilot feels free to speak up his mind, and or even take control of the aircraft if he has to, if an unsafe situation develops. And standard operating procedures, sticking to the rules.
I see. And can you give us what is stall? I mean, we've been hearing the recordings and they said the plane stalled. So can you give us a brief description what is stall and how does it happen?
Sure. An aircraft stall is an aerodynamic stall. It's when the wings exceed the critical angle of attack and they can no longer produce enough lift and the airplane falls out of the sky. It's too slow of an airspeed. That's not to be confused with an engine stall or a compressor stall. For example, in your car, if your engine stalls, it quits, right? Well, on a jet engine, if a compressor stall occurs, which is also an aerodynamic stall inside the engine, that can lead to engine failure. So when the aircraft stalls, they're talking about too slow of an airspeed. The wings cannot continue to produce lift at that slow airspeed, and so the aircraft stalls. And given enough altitude, you can recover from it. And it's something that everybody practices when they're learning how to fly.
I see. So thank you for giving us your time. And I hope there aren't any events like that in the future. And thank you.
Yeah, condolences to everybody involved with this tragedy. They will get to the bottom of this, and there will be many lessons learned from this. So pay attention to those lessons learned, and everybody around the world is watching this very closely.